Major Gerald Holt grabbed Madison by the collar of her flight suit and shoved her backward into the briefing room wall. "You want the warthog," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "Then you are finished in this squadron, finished. You are an insult to every pilot in this room." He grabbed her assignment folder and threw it across the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Madison looked at him. Her voice came out quiet, dangerous. "Write that down, Major, because one day you will want to take it back." She had no idea how soon that day would come. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to our channel and follow Madison's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The laughter started before the echo of her words had even left the room. It started as a low sound, almost like disbelief, a collective inhale followed by a few short bursts. Then it spread. It moved across the rows of flight suits and polished boots, the way fire moves across dry grass fast and uncontrolled, until the entire officer briefing room at Columbus Air Force Base was filled with the sound of pilots laughing at Captain Madison Reed. She stood at the front of that room and did not move. She did not look down. She did not shift her weight. She did not offer them the satisfaction of watching her cheeks color or her jaw tighten. She had spent enough years learning how to hold herself still in rooms where she was not supposed to belong. But this was different. This was the aircraft selection day that pilots talked about for months before it arrived. This was the moment when the best graduates in the class walked up to the assignment board and made the choice that would define the next decade of their careers. The room was full of men who had spent months trading rumors about which pilot would take the F-35, who would get the F-22, who was being watched for the most advanced programs in the United States Air Force. Nobody had been talking about the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Nobody serious anyway. Major Thomas Walker stood at the front of the room with a clipboard and the kind of expression that came from 20 years of watching pilots make both the best and worst decisions of their lives. He had dark eyes that moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he has learned that most things worth seeing require patience. He looked at Madison when the laughter crested. He did not laugh, but he also did not stop it. "Captain Reed," he said, his voice cutting just slightly above the noise. "Would you like to elaborate?" She had not asked for the chance to elaborate. She had simply answered his question. He had pointed to the board, asked for her selection, and she had given it. But she understood what he was really asking. He was giving her an exit, a chance to smile, brush it off, say she was kidding, and point to the F-35 like everyone expected. She looked at him steadily. "No, sir," she said. "I want the A-10. I said what I meant." The laughter faded, not because anyone suddenly respected her decision. It faded the way laughter does when people realize the joke is not going to land the way they expected, when the target refuses to perform embarrassment. Lieutenant Jason Cole, who was sitting in the second row with his flight gloves resting on his knee like a prop, leaned toward the pilot beside him and said, without lowering his voice nearly enough, "She actually means it." The pilot beside him, a tall man named Lieutenant Derek Simmons, who had been a standout in every combat simulation for the past year, shook his head slowly. "She could fly anything in the inventory," Simmons said, "and she picks the warthog." He said the word warthog the way someone says a punchline. Madison heard all of it. She was meant to hear all of it. She turned her eyes to the assignment board and studied it the way she always studied anything that mattered to her. The way she had studied topographic maps as a child, the way she had memorized every system in every aircraft she had ever touched with the total attention of someone who understood that details saved lives. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the board like an afterthought. Below the gleaming designations of the fifth-generation fighters, below the acronyms that represented billions of dollars and decades of aerospace ambition, there was the old machine, the ground attack aircraft, the one the Air Force had been trying to retire for the better part of a decade and somehow never quite managed to, because every time the retirement paperwork came through, some general with combat experience quietly set it aside. Madison knew exactly why that happened. She had been studying it for years. Major Walker walked toward her, slowly, his clipboard at his side, his voice dropping so that only the two of them in the nearest row of pilots could clearly hear what came next. "Madison," he said, and the use of her first name was not an honor. It was a warning, the kind of quiet that a mentor uses when he is trying to save someone from themselves. "The A-10 is old technology. It flies low. It is loud. It has no stealth capability. It gets close to enemy fire by design. The survival profile of that aircraft compared to what you could be flying is not a small difference. It is significant. I know, sir. You graduated second in your class. You had the highest tactical awareness score any instructor in this program has recorded in 11 years. I know, sir. You are telling me you want to fly a close air support platform that was designed in the 1970s. Yes, sir. He studied her for a moment. There was something in his expression that shifted, something that was not quite frustration and not quite admiration, but lived in the space between the two, a kind of reluctant recognition. Why he asked, and Madison Reed said the thing that would follow her for the next 8 months, the thing that would be repeated by men who meant it as mockery and would eventually be repeated by the same men with something approaching awe. Because when soldiers are on the ground and everything has gone wrong, she said, they do not need an aircraft that can evade radar from 40,000 feet. They need someone willing to come down to where they are. The room was quiet. Jason Cole broke it first. Noble, he said, and his voice carried the particular texture of someone who has decided that sincerity is naive. Very noble, very touching. But nobility does not win a dogfight, Captain. Madison looked at him. The A-10 was not designed to win dogfights, Lieutenant, she said. It was designed to save the people who are already in the middle of one. She turned back to the board. I want the A-10. Major Walker wrote it down. The laughter that followed her out of the briefing room was quieter than the first wave. More uncertain, the way laughter gets when it starts to suspect it might be wrong. Madison Reed had not arrived at this decision in a single afternoon. She had arrived at it the way most profound decisions are made, gradually through experience and loss in the particular education that comes from understanding what it actually means to fail someone. She grew up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the mountains are real and close and constant, where the horizon is never flat, where people learn early that the terrain itself can become the enemy. Her father had been a mechanic, not a military mechanic, not a man who understood aircraft from the inside, but a man who understood machines the way artists understand their medium, intuitively, with respect and without illusion. I used to tell her that a machine is only as honest as the person running it. She thought about that a great deal. She had earned her wings through a combination of exceptional talent and the kind of stubborn preparation that looks from the outside like natural ability. She was not someone who found things easy. She was someone who refused to find things impossible. There was a difference, and she understood it, and that understanding was part of what made her dangerous in a cockpit. But the moment that shaped everything, the moment she never spoke about in briefings or performance reviews, because it was not the kind of moment that fits into official language, had happened during a training exercise in her second year. A simulated convoy, a simulated attack, a simulated pilot who came in too high, too fast, too committed to the performance metrics of altitude and stealth, and missed the window. Nobody died. It was a simulation. But she had been in the ground vehicle. She had been one of the simulated soldiers. And she remembered the 10 seconds between the moment she understood the air support was not going to reach them in time and the moment the exercise was called. 10 seconds was nothing. 10 seconds was everything. She spent the next 3 years thinking about what kind of aircraft, what kind of pilot, what kind of decision-making would have changed those 10 seconds. The answer was not the aircraft with the best radar signature profile. The answer was the aircraft willing to come down. The first 6 months at Nellis Air Force Base, where she completed her A-10 qualification training, were the most difficult of her career. Not because the aircraft was difficult to master. It was not easy, but difficulty had never stopped her. The aircraft demanded a kind of flying that was closer to hand-to-hand combat than to the elegant precision of high-altitude strike missions. The A-10 was loud and heavy and ugly in the way that only truly functional things can be ugly, without apology, without vanity, with complete commitment to purpose. She loved it immediately. The difficulty was everything else. The other pilots in her transition program were men who had been assigned to the A-10 because their scores were not high enough for the platforms they had wanted. They had not chosen this. They were here by default, and they flew that way with the sullen precision of people completing an obligation. When Madison showed enthusiasm for the systems, for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, for the manual reversion flight control system that allowed the aircraft to be flown without hydraulics, for the titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit and gave the pilot a fighting chance against direct enemy fire. The other pilots looked at her the way people look at someone who is enthusiastic about a task they consider beneath them. One afternoon, a pilot named First Lieutenant Marcus Webb walked into the maintenance bay where Madison was reviewing battle damage, repair reports from previous operations, not required reading for her level, but the kind of thing she did on her own time. "You actually read those for fun?" he asked. "I read them to understand what this aircraft can survive," she said. He pulled one of the reports off the stack she had already reviewed. It was a mission summary from 2008 in A-10 that had taken significant ground fire during close air support operations in Iraq, lost most of its hydraulic system, and still returned to base. "You know what I see when I read these," he said. "What, Bob?" "An aircraft that gets shot at constantly because it has to fly low enough to get shot at. An aircraft that can absorb that fire and still complete the mission," she said. He put the report down. "You are going to get yourself killed in that thing," he said. It was not said unkindly. It was the observation of someone who had genuinely decided he was correct. "Somebody has to fly it," she said. He shrugged and walked out. She went back to her reading. When her orders came through for deployment to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, assigned to the 74th Fighter Squadron, she packed her gear with the methodical calm that she had trained into herself over years of practice. She did not allow herself excitement that could shade into recklessness or anxiety that could shade into hesitation. She simply prepared. The 74th Fighter Squadron was a mixed unit. Most of its pilots flew F-16s. There were 2 A-10 pilots permanently assigned, and Madison would be the third brought in to cover a gap created by a pilot rotation that had left the close air support capability understaffed going into a period of elevated operational tempo. The commanding officer of the 74th was Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Hayes, a tall man with the kind of face that had been weathered by genuine experience rather than performed severity. He had flown over 200 combat missions. He had the decorations to prove it and the quiet to prove it too, the particular stillness of someone who has seen enough that he does not need noise to assert authority. He reviewed her file on the afternoon she reported in. She stood in front of his desk and waited. "Your qualification scores are exceptional," he said without looking up. "Thank you, sir. Your instructors describe you as the most tactically aware pilot they have trained in 11 years. That was Major Walker's language, sir. I would not use it myself." He looked up. "Why not?" "Because tactical awareness is not a fixed quality," she said. "Every mission changes what you know. What I knew yesterday may not be sufficient for what tomorrow requires." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the file. "The A-10 pilots in this squadron are not the stars of the show," he said. "I want you to understand that clearly before we go any further. The F-16 drivers get the high-profile missions, the interdiction strikes, the precision targeting. The A-10s are ground support. You go where the soldiers need you. You go low, you go slow, you get shot at." "Yes, sir," she said. "That is why I requested this assignment." Hayes stopped turning pages. He looked at her again, and this time the look lasted longer. "Most pilots assigned to the A-10 are not here by choice," he said. "I am aware of that, sir. You want to explain why you are different?" She told him the same thing she had told Major Walker, about the soldiers on the ground, about the 10-second window, about the aircraft willing to come down. Hayes listened to all of it without expression. When she finished, he nodded once. "Report to the flight operations officer at 0600 tomorrow," he said. "You will fly your first familiarization mission over designated airspace. Standard protocol. Do not deviate." "Yes, sir." "One more thing," he said as she turned to leave. She stopped. "The pilots in this squadron have already heard about you, about your selection, about your scores." He paused. "And about your choice of aircraft." "I imagine they would have, sir. They have a nickname for you," he said. "They are calling you Angel." She did not react. "They do not mean it as a compliment," he added. "I know, sir," she said, "but it could be worse." They could be ignoring me." She walked out. Hayes watched the door close and sat with his file for another moment before he put it down. He had been flying long enough to know the difference between arrogance and certainty. Arrogance was loud and borrowed and collapsed under pressure. Certainty was quiet and earned and held. He had not decided which one Captain Reed carried, but he intended to find out. So, the first 3 weeks in theater passed in the rhythm of operational flying. Dawn missions, debrief, maintenance checks, mission planning. The particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained mental intensity, from the requirement to be accurate and present in every moment, because imprecision in this environment had consequences that followed you home. Madison flew with discipline and without incident, but the nickname followed her everywhere. In the chow hall, pilots nodded at her with the particular smirk of people sharing a joke she was not supposed to understand. In the mission planning room, when she laid out a low-altitude attack approach for a scenario exercise, a pilot named Captain Brian Holloway said loud enough for the whole room, "Angel wants to fly the valley floor again. Somebody warn the mountain goats." The room laughed. Madison corrected her approach on the planning board and explained with precision and without visible irritation exactly why the low-altitude entry was tactically superior for the given target set. The room was less amused after the explanation. But the nickname stayed. She had heard it so many times by the end of the third week that it had stopped carrying any particular weight. It was just a sound now, her call sign. They could have chosen worse. What she did not know on the morning of the 23rd day was that by the time she climbed back out of her cockpit that evening, the sound of her call sign would carry a weight that nobody in the 74th Fighter Squadron had ever attached to a name. So, the briefing that morning was routine. That was the word Lieutenant Colonel Hayes used. Routine. The morning intelligence assessment showed elevated activity along the eastern corridor, but elevated activity had been the baseline condition for the past 2 months. The convoy mission designated Alpha was a logistics run into the Kunar province. Supply delivery. Road had been traveled dozens of times. Security escort was in place. Timeline was tight but manageable. Madison was not assigned to the Alpha mission. She was assigned to a training profile, a structured weapons employment exercise over a designated range area. The kind of flying that kept proficiency sharp and gave the squadron documented metrics to submit in quarterly reviews. She filed her mission plan at 0500. By 0700, Convoy Alpha was rolling. By 0900, everything had changed. She was an hour into her training flight when the radio frequency she was monitoring as secondary traffic, the ground forces frequency assigned to the Kunar operations sector, suddenly filled with a sound she had heard only in simulation. It was not quite panic. Panic was disorganized, scattered, high-pitched. This was something more controlled than panic, but more urgent than concern. This was the voice of a professional soldier communicating under fire, compressing fear into information, because information was the only thing that saved lives. All stations, this is Alpha Actual. Convoy Alpha is under attack. We are in Black Ridge Pass. We have vehicles down. We have casualties. We are taking fire from elevated positions, north and south. We need immediate close air support. Repeat, immediate close air support. Madison's hands did not move from the controls. Her mind moved instead. She was not assigned to this mission. She was on a training profile. Her weapons loadout was configured for range exercise, not combat. The airspace between her current position and Black Ridge Pass was not cleared for her transit. Protocol required her to break off her training flight report back to base and wait for the mission assignment process to generate an authorized tasking order. Protocol would take 45 minutes. She had listened to that radio transmission. She understood, in the particular way that comes from 3 years of reading battle damage reports and studying 10-second windows, that 45 minutes was not the number she was working with. She keyed her radio. Kunar Sector Operations, this is Angel Flight. I am current position 27 miles northwest of Black Ridge Pass with full combat load and fuel states sufficient for engagement. Request immediate clearance for close air support, Convoy Alpha. There was a pause on the frequency, then a voice she did not recognize. Angel Flight, this is Kunar Ops. You are not on the tasking order for Alpha. Stand by. She knew what standby meant. It meant no. It meant wait. It meant 45 minutes. She looked out of the cockpit at the mountain range below her, at the geography she had memorized the way her father taught her to memorize things that mattered, the way the passes cut between the peaks, the way the valley floor of Black Ridge narrowed to nothing in its center, the way an enemy with elevated positions in the patience to wait would set up exactly the ambush that Alpha Actual was now describing on the radio. She had flown this terrain in her mind 100 times. She knew what she would see if she dove toward it right now. She also knew what she would see in 45 minutes. She keyed the radio again. Kunar Ops Angel Flight, requesting to speak with the senior controller on duty. Priority traffic. Another pause. Then a different voice. Older. More tired. More real. Angel Flight, this is Senior Controller Daniels. What is your situation? Sir, I have eyes on the grid for Black Ridge Pass from my current position. My fuel and weapons state allow for immediate engagement in support of Alpha. I am requesting emergency mission authorization, understanding rules for immediate close air support of troops in contact. Angel Flight, you are not current mission assigned to that area. Senior Controller Daniels, she said, and her voice was as steady as she could make it, as clear as she could make it, as stripped of everything unnecessary as she could make it. Alpha actual reports multiple casualties and vehicles destroyed. Weather above the pass is degrading. By the time a formal tasking order is generated and a mission-assigned aircraft is airborne, and on station, I estimate they will have been in the ambush for more than 50 minutes. I am here now. I have what they need. I am requesting authorization. The radio was quiet for what felt to Madison like a very long time. Then Daniel said, "Stand by, Angel Flight." She waited. Below her, a mountain range ran north to south like a scar across the earth. Somewhere inside it, soldiers were counting seconds. She thought about her father's hands, the way he held a wrench, the care he took with things that mattered. She thought about 10 seconds. She waited. The authorization took 11 minutes. Not 45, 11. She would learn later that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had been monitoring the same frequency from the operations center, had walked into the controller room and placed himself directly in front of Senior Controller Daniels and said 4 words while authorize the Angel Flight. She did not know that yet. What she knew was that the radio crackled and Senior Controller Daniels came back on the frequency and said, "Angel Flight, you are cleared for immediate close air support, convoy Alpha Black Ridge Pass. Alpha Actual is monitoring this frequency. Rules of engagement are standard troops in contact. You are weapons free on confirmed enemy positions." She did not respond with enthusiasm. She responded with precision. Angel Flight copies all. Weapons free on confirmed enemy positions. En route to Alpha. ETA 4 minutes. Then she pushed the nose of the A-10 down and toward the mountains. The training profile was over. The thing she had spent years preparing for had begun. The radio chatter from Alpha increased as she closed the distance. She listened to it with the particular attention of someone who is building a picture from sound alone. The convoy commander, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, was talking in short bursts, clear, controlled. The professional discipline of a man who had been through bad situations before and understood that communication was a weapon. "We have 2 vehicles destroyed at the front and rear of the column. We are boxed in, enemy fire from the ridgeline north elevation, approximately 300 meters above road level. Secondary fire from the south wall closer range. We have 4 wounded, 2 critical." "Alpha, this is Angel Flight," Madison said. "I have your grid. I am 60 seconds out. Do you have smoke available to mark your position?" "Angel Flight, we have red smoke. Popping now." She saw it before she saw anything else. A thin column of red rising from the valley floor, almost immediately swept sideways by the wind that moved through the pass like something alive. She adjusted her approach angle and locked the column of color into her awareness, the way she locked everything that mattered permanently without the need to look away. "Alpha, I have your smoke. Red smoke confirmed. I am beginning my attack run. Keep your heads down." Brooks came back immediately. "Angel Flight, be advised, we have friendlies on the road from marker to marker. North ridgeline is all enemy. South wall enemy positions are concentrated in the lower third. Do not engage upper portion." "Copies all," she said. "Stand by." She had 45 seconds before her weapons were in range. She used all 45 of them. She ran the geometry of the attack in her mind. The angle of descent required to engage the north ridgeline without putting ordnance near the road surface. The exit vector that would take her away from the south wall quickly enough to set up a follow-on attack, the exact moment she needed to release to account for the wind she had observed hitting that red smoke column. There was no computer generating these calculations. There was Madison Reed. At 20 seconds, she armed her weapon systems. At 10 seconds, she checked her escape route. At 5 seconds, she said almost to herself and also to the aircraft and also to the soldiers below, "Okay." The GAU-8 Avenger spoke. It did not speak quietly. The sound of it rolled down the valley like something geological, like the sound of the mountain itself being rearranged. Convoy Alpha heard it before they saw anything. Brooks heard it from behind the burning wreck of the lead vehicle where he had been managing his wounded, and the sound went through him like electricity. He looked up. The A-10 came over the ridgeline so low that for a moment Brooks genuinely could not understand what he was seeing. He had heard close air support described before. He had received it before. But he had never had it arrive like this, at this angle, at this speed, this committed, this close to the earth itself. The North Ridgeline erupted. Enemy positions that had held the high ground for the past 40 minutes simply ceased to function. And then the aircraft was gone past them, pulling up hard into the sky above the valley. And Sergeant Daniel Brooks said to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who has just understood something fundamental, "She came down," because that was the thing. That was the thing nobody had understood when they looked at the assignment board and saw the A-10 and thought about altitude and radar signatures and stealth profiles. The thing that mattered was not how high you could fly. The thing that mattered was whether you were willing to come down. An angel had come down. The fight was far from over, but the soldiers of Convoy Alpha knew in that moment that someone had chosen them. And that knowledge, the simple animal certainty of not being alone, changed everything about what they were capable of holding on to next. The GAU-8 had gone silent, but the valley had not. Sergeant Daniel Brooks pressed himself against the burned-out hull of the lead vehicle and listened to the echo rolling back off the mountain walls, that deep mechanical thunder that had come from nowhere and rearranged the North Ridgeline in under 4 seconds. His ears were ringing, his hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, from the particular trembling that comes when the body understands it has just survived something the mind has not fully processed yet. Private First Class Kevin Merritt crawled up beside him. 22 years old, 3 months in country, he had been crying without knowing it, and the tracks on his face were already drying in the cold mountain air. "Was that our air support?" he said. "That was our air support," Brooks said. One aircraft. One aircraft." Merritt looked up at the sky where the A-10 had already disappeared above the ridgeline, climbing hard, pulling away from the valley floor with the kind of speed that seemed impossible for something that large and that loud. "It came down so low," Merritt said. "I thought it was going to hit the road." Brooks said nothing. He was already back on the radio. "Angel Flight, this is Alpha Actual. North Ridgeline is suppressed. We still have active fire from the south wall. I have 2 soldiers who need immediate evacuation. What is your status?" The response came back in the same steady voice that had first appeared on the frequency 20 minutes ago. No excitement, no adrenaline bleeding into the transmission, just precision. "Alpha Angel Flight, I am repositioning for south wall engagement. 30 seconds. Confirm your casualties are away from the south exposure." Brooks turned and shouted across the road, "Everybody on the north side of the vehicles now move." Men scrambled. 2 soldiers half carried a third between them, his leg wrapped in a field dressing that was already soaked through. A 4th soldier was being dragged by his vest unconscious, his boots leaving parallel lines in the dirt as he moved. Brooks counted heads. 14 men accounted for. 2 vehicles destroyed. 1 vehicle still running, engine intact, driver crouched behind the wheel waiting for the word. He keyed the radio. "Angel Flight friendlies are consolidated north side. South wall is clear for engagement." "Copies. Stand by." Brooks stood up slightly and looked at the south wall. He saw the A-10 before he heard it. It came around the eastern end of the pass at an angle that looked wrong, too steep, too aggressive, the kind of approach that in any other aircraft would have meant a controlled flight into terrain. But the A-10 was not any other aircraft, and the pilot flying it was not flying by the textbook that applied to other aircraft. Madison had spent the 30-second repositioning, calculating the exact problem in front of her. The south wall engagement was more complex than the North Ridgeline. The North Ridgeline had been a clean, elevated target enemy, positions spread along the top, open exposure, straightforward gun run. The south wall was different. Enemy fighters were in the lower third, Brooks had said. The upper portion was clear, possibly civilian infrastructure, possibly nothing, but possibly something that changed the entire engagement if she guessed wrong. She was not going to guess. She came in at the angle that gave her the longest possible look at the target area before her weapons came into range. She was not doing this from instinct. She was doing it from 3 years of studying how A-10 pilots in previous conflicts had solved exactly this category of problem. the embedded enemy, the restricted engagement zone, the target that required visual confirmation rather than sensor designation. At 500 meters, she saw the muzzle flash, not a guess, not an inference. She saw it. 3 positions, lower third of the wall, exactly where Brooks had told her. Alpha Angel Flight, I have eyes on 3 confirmed enemy positions. South wall, lower third, I am engaging. Do not move. She fired. The cannon ran for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough. The south wall went quiet. Brooks exhaled a sound that was not quite a word. It came from somewhere below language, from the part of a person that exists before speech, the part that simply registers the difference between alive and not alive. Angel Flight, he said, and his voice had changed. South wall is clear. I say again, south wall is clear. Alpha copies. I am climbing to assess. Give me your full casualty count and vehicle status. Brooks ran through it quickly. 2 vehicles destroyed, 4 wounded, 2 critical. 1 vehicle operational, 12 soldiers mobile and combat effective. The pass itself was not yet safe. Enemy forces had been in the area in larger numbers than the ambush party. The intelligence assessment from that morning had underestimated the concentration significantly, and there was a real possibility of a follow-on attack before a ground rescue element could reach them. Madison processed all of it at altitude, circling above the pass in a wide orbit that let her eyes cover the terrain in all directions, while her mind worked the problem. She had enough fuel for approximately 40 additional minutes of station time. She had weapons remaining. What she did not have was certainty about what was coming next. And that uncertainty, more than the enemy, fire, more than the terrain, more than the weather that was building to the west and moving toward the pass with the slow inevitability of a tide, was the thing she needed to solve. She keyed the frequency back to Kunar Ops. Kunar Ops Angel Flight. Alpha is temporarily clear. I need a ground rescue element and medical evacuation on the fastest possible timeline. I have 2 critical casualties. What is the status of QRF? Senior Controller Daniels came back. Angel Flight QRF is spinning up now. ETA to your position is approximately 55 minutes. 55 minutes. She looked at her fuel gauge. 40 minutes of station time. The math was not complicated, and the math was also not acceptable. Kunar Ops, I will be bingo fuel in 40 minutes. I need a replacement aircraft on station before I depart, or those soldiers are exposed. Angel Flight, we are working it. Stand by. She hated those words, but she stayed in her orbit and watched the terrain below and said nothing else on that frequency because the frequency needed to stay clear and because what she was thinking was not something that belonged on a radio transmission. What she was thinking was that the 55-minute QRF timeline assumed no complications. It assumed roads that were passable. It assumed no secondary ambush between the QRF staging point and Black Ridge Pass. It assumed the weather to the west held off for another hour. None of those assumptions felt reliable. She dropped her orbit lower and began a systematic sweep of the terrain north of the pass, looking for movement, looking for vehicles, looking for the signature of a force, repositioning after an initial attack. She found it 11 minutes later. It was not a large force, but it did not need to be large. A group of fighters moving along a ridgeline trail approximately 2 kilometers north of Black Ridge Pass heading south, heading toward the convoy, moving with the purposeful, unhurried pace of people who believed they had time on their side. Madison counted 14, maybe 16, enough to overwhelm a convoy that was already down 2 vehicles and had 4 wounded men who could not fight. She keyed the radio immediately. Alpha Actual Angel Flight, I have a follow-on force moving toward your position from the north. Approximately 14 to 16 personnel 2 kilometers out. Current pace puts them at your location in approximately 25 minutes. Brooks absorbed this without a sound. Then, Angel Flight, can you engage? She checked her weapon state. She had enough. Affirm, but Alpha, I need you to listen carefully. After I engage this element, I will have limited weapons remaining, and my fuel state will be critical. You need to get your people into the 1 operational vehicle and be ready to move the moment I tell you the route north is clear. Do you understand? Understood, Angel Flight. We will be ready. Keep this frequency clear. I will talk you through it. She pushed the nose down. The follow-on force never reached Black Ridge Pass. When the engagement was over, Madison pulled up hard and climbed back to altitude and checked her fuel state. and felt the number in her chest the way you feel a deadline, not as information but as pressure, as the specific weight of time running out. She had 18 minutes of station time remaining. QRF was still 44 minutes out. She went back on the radio. Kunar Ops Angel Flight, I have suppressed a follow-on attack. I now have 18 minutes of fuel remaining. I need a replacement on station, or I need that QRF timeline compressed. One of those two things has to happen. Daniels responded. Angel Flight, we have an F-16 element that can be on station in 22 minutes. 22 minutes. She had 18, 4 minutes of gap, 4 minutes where Black Ridge Pass would have air cover from exactly nobody. She stayed on the frequency. Kunar Ops, I need you to hear me clearly. There is a 4-minute window between my departure and the F-16 element's arrival. In that window, Alpha is exposed with 4 wounded and limited ammunition. I need you to compress that timeline or authorize me to extend my station time beyond bingo fuel. There was a pause. Then Daniel said something she had not expected. Angel Flight Lieutenant Colonel Hayes is on the line for you. A different voice came on the frequency, the voice she had heard once in his office on her first day, the voice that had measured her without performing judgment. Captain Reed, Hayes said, what is your actual fuel state? She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. If you extend beyond bingo and your engine performance degrades over the mountains, you will not make the base. Yes, sir. You understand what I am telling you? Yes, sir. Another pause. What is your read on the threat to Alpha if we have a 4-minute gap in coverage? She told him exactly what she thought, that the terrain north of the pass still had movement she could not fully account for, that the enemy force she had just engaged may have had communication with other elements, that 4 minutes in a situation this fluid was not a theoretical risk, it was a likely one. Hayes said nothing for a long moment. Then, your call, Captain. 3 words. The kind of 3 words that carried the full weight of a commanding officer placing trust in a subordinate, not because protocol required it, but because experience demanded it. She did not hesitate. I am extending station time, she said. I will make the base. Copies, Hayes said, and then quietly, so quietly she almost missed it through the static, good hunting, Angel. She went back to work. The next 14 minutes were the most concentrated flying of Madison Reed's life. She could not afford to simply orbit and watch. Every pass she made over the terrain had to serve a purpose, had to gather information, had to communicate to any enemy element, watching from the ridges that the airspace over Black Ridge Pass was occupied and hostile to anyone who moved toward the convoy below. She flew a presence pattern, deliberately visible, deliberately aggressive in her angles, using the sight and sound of the A-10 as a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. She came low over the pass on each orbit, low enough that Brooks and his soldiers could hear her, low enough that the sound of the engine was itself a message. You are not alone. She is still here. Brooks understood what she was doing. He got on the radio during the 9th minute of her extended station time. Angel Flight, Alpha Actual. Go ahead, Alpha. I just want you to know, Brooks said, and his voice had a quality in it that was different from the combat communications of the past 40 minutes, stripped of its operational precision, carrying something underneath that was simply human. My guys can hear you every time you come over. Every time. Madison did not respond to that directly. What she said was, how are your critical casualties holding? Sergeant Paulson is stable. Private Torres is fighting. QRF is coming, she said. Hold on. We are holding, Brooks said, because of you. She did not know what to do with that. She put it somewhere she would look at later and went back to scanning the terrain. The F-16 element arrived at 21 minutes, 1 minute ahead of the projected timeline. Madison heard them check in on the frequency and felt something in her chest release a tension she had been holding so completely that she had stopped registering it as tension and had started registering it as simply the way air felt inside her lungs. Alpha Actual, this is Viper Flight. We are on station. Angel Flight, we have you in sight. You are cleared to depart. She did one more orbit. Not because it was necessary, because she needed to see the convoy one more time from above to see the cluster of vehicles and the figures moving around them, and confirm with her own eyes what the radio had been telling her, that they were still there, that they were still holding, that the thing she had spent the last 53 minutes doing had been enough. It had been enough. She turned the nose of the A-10 west and began the flight back to Bagram. Her fuel state was well past bingo. She was running on the margin between careful and desperate, the margin where the gauges become less reliable than the pilot's feel for the aircraft. And her feel for this aircraft after 8 months of flying, it was as intimate as anything she had ever known. The mountains below her were enormous and indifferent. She flew over them without sentiment and with complete attention. When the base appeared in the distance, she allowed herself exactly 1 second of something that was not quite relief, because relief implied the possibility of failure, and she had not allowed herself to consider failure as a real outcome during any of the past 53 minutes. What she felt was closer to recognition. This was the thing she had chosen the A-10 for. This exact thing. Not the fame of it, not the decoration that might follow, not the moment in the debrief when someone told her she had done well. The simple fact of it, soldiers were alive who would not have been alive. That was the transaction she had signed up for on the day she walked to the assignment board and said 2 words that made an entire room laugh. The warthog, her warthog. She touched down at Bagram with a fuel state that made the ground crew go quiet when they checked the gauges afterward. One of the maintainers, a staff sergeant named Rodriguez, who had been working A-10s for 11 years and had seen pilots come back on fumes before, walked around the aircraft twice before he said anything. Then he looked at Madison. "You know how close that was?" "I had a general idea," she said. He shook his head, not in criticism, in something closer to respect. "Aircraft is going to need a full fuel system inspection before she flies again," he said. "You ran her that dry." "Make sure she is ready," Madison said. "She flew well today." Rodriguez looked at the aircraft the way men who love machines look at machines that have done something extraordinary. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "She did." The debrief was held at 1400 hours in the operations center. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes ran it himself. Every pilot in the 74th was present, not because the debrief required their presence, but because Hayes had sent word through the operations officer that attendance was expected. He had used that specific word, expected. In the vocabulary of Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Hayes, expected carried the weight that mandatory carried in other men's mouths. Madison sat at the table and gave her account with the same precision she brought to everything. Gun run angles, weapons expenditure, fuel management, timeline of engagements, assessment of follow-on threat, decision rationale for extending station time beyond bingo fuel. Hayes listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "At the point where you made the decision to extend beyond bingo, what was your confidence level that you could make the base?" She considered the question for a moment. 70%, sir." The room was completely still. Hayes nodded slowly. "And you made that call anyway." The alternative confidence level for Alpha surviving the 4-minute coverage gap was lower than 70%, sir. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. "Does anyone have questions for Captain Reed?" The room was quiet. Captain Brian Holloway, who had made the mountain goat joke 3 weeks earlier, was sitting 2 seats down from Madison. He had his hands flat on the table and he was looking at them. He did not have a question. Lieutenant Jason Cole, who had called her noble with the voice of a man explaining why sincerity was naive, was sitting across the table. He was looking at the wall behind Hayes's head with the particular expression of someone recalculating something they thought they had already settled. He did not have a question either. Nobody had a question. Hayes closed the debrief folder. "Alpha Actual has formally requested," he said, his voice measured neutral, carrying the information without performing its weight, "that the pilot-designated Angel Flight be officially commended for actions in support of Convoy Alpha Black Ridge Pass this date." He paused. "I have approved the commendation." He looked at Madison. "Well done, Captain Reed." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." She stood to leave. And then Hayes said something that was not in the debrief protocol, something that had no official home in the language of Air Force after action reviews. "They could hear you," he said, "every time you came over. Your aircraft. They could hear it." And Brooks said it was the only thing that told them they were going to make it. Madison stood very still. "Soldiers have died waiting for air support that was afraid to come down," Hayes said. "Today, they lived because someone wasn't." He did not add anything to that. He did not need to. Madison walked out of the operations center into the cold air of the Afghan afternoon and stood for a moment without moving. Somewhere in the eastern mountains, Convoy Alpha was moving again. Sergeant Brooks was on the radio, with his base, accounting for his men, managing his wounded, doing the 100 necessary things that followed survival. Private Torres was in a medical helicopter still fighting. The A-10 was in the maintenance bay fuel system being inspected, a ground crew that had worked on this aircraft for months, running their hands over it with the particular attention of people who understood that the machine had just done something that would be talked about. And in the briefing room back at Columbus Air Force Base, on a wall that held assignment records for every class that had come through, the notation for the class that included Madison Reed still read the same thing it had always read. A-10 Thunderbolt 2, Reed M. Captain. The notation that everyone had read as a mistake, that now read like a prophecy. Inside the 74th Fighter Squadron, the nickname had not changed, Angel, but the way people said it had changed completely. 3 hours after the debrief, Madison was in the maintenance bay checking on the aircraft inspection when Captain Holloway appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, and she was aware of him standing there, and she continued checking the fuel system report without turning around. He walked in. He stood beside her. He looked at the A-10 the way she had always looked at it, not as a relic, not as a compromise, but as something that deserved to be seen clearly. "I made a joke," he said, "about the mountain goats." "I remember," she said. "I was wrong," he said. Not sorry, not apologetic. Just wrong, stated plainly, the way a professional acknowledges a professional error. She looked at him. "You were not wrong that it gets shot at," she said. "No," he said. "I was wrong that it mattered." She went back to the report. He stood there another moment. Then he said, "Why an A-10? I mean, really, not the answer you gave Walker, the real one." She thought about her father's hands. She thought about a simulation in her second year and 10 seconds that had never stopped mattering. She thought about the red smoke rising crooked from the valley floor, and the sound the cannon made when it spoke, and Brooks's voice on the radio saying she came down so low. Because the soldiers on the ground, she said, deserve someone willing to be where they are. Holloway was quiet, then he nodded. He walked out of the maintenance bay without another word. Madison went back to the fuel system report. The A-10 stood beside her in the bay, bullet scarred and fuel exhausted and entirely without apology. The same way she had always stood. Rodriguez came back in with the final inspection numbers. "She is going to need 48 hours minimum," he said, "but she will fly." "Good," Madison said. "You did too," he said, in case nobody said it. She looked at him. "I was not a man who offered compliments for the performance of them." "Somebody said it." He nodded and went back to his work. And Madison Reed stood in the maintenance bay at Bagram Air Base with the cold coming through the walls and the sound of the base around her. And somewhere in the eastern mountains, the soldiers she had gone down for continuing their work, continuing their living, and the call sign that had started as a joke settling permanently into something that was going to be very difficult to laugh at ever again. Private First Class Marcus Torres did not die. That fact arrived at Bagram 48 hours after Black Ridge Pass in the form of a single line in a medical status report that Madison read standing next to the A-10 while Rodriguez and his crew finished the final inspection checks. Torres had been the critical casualty. Brooks had mentioned the one still fighting when Madison had turned the nose west and started the long run home on fumes and certainty. He had lost significant blood. He had required surgery at the forward surgical team and a second surgery at the larger facility at Bagram, but he had not died. Madison read the line twice. Then she folded the report and put it in her flight suit pocket. Rodriguez looked over at her from under the wing. "Good news," he said. "The soldier who was critical," she said. "He made it." Rodriguez nodded once. He went back to his inspection without a word. But she noticed that his movements after that were slightly slower, slightly more careful. The way a man moves when he is thinking about something that matters to him and does not want to interrupt the thinking by moving too fast. She understood that. She felt it too. Torres was alive. Sergeant Brooks was alive. 14 soldiers who had driven into Black Ridge Pass that morning were alive and would eventually go home to people who needed them to come home. That was the transaction. That was what the fuel gauge and the weapon state and the bingo calculation and the decision to extend station time had been about. It was a clean transaction. But the world was not interested in clean transactions for long. By the morning of the third day after Black Ridge Pass, the story had moved. It started the way these things always started, not with a formal announcement, but with the particular velocity of information inside a closed military community where news travels faster than orders and reputation travels faster than news. Someone in Kunar Ops had talked to someone in the 74th maintenance section. Someone in the 74th maintenance section had talked to someone in the flight operations office at another base. The story moved in fragments in the compressed shorthand of people who communicate in acronyms and call signs in the specialized vocabulary of military aviation. And in that compression, certain elements became larger than others. The fuel state at landing became legendary first. Rodriguez had made the mistake, or perhaps the deliberate choice of mentioning the numbers to a fellow maintainer from a different unit during a routine supply coordination meeting 2 days after the mission. He had not meant it as gossip. He was a man who respected machines and the people who flew them, and what he was expressing was a kind of professional awe. The recognition that the margins Madison had operated within were margins that very few pilots in very few circumstances had ever operated within and come out the other side intact. But the number moved through the base the way numbers do when they are remarkable enough to carry themselves. By day 3, Madison was aware that people were looking at her differently. Not all people. Major Gerald Holt arrived at Bagram on day 3. She did not know he was coming. Nobody told her, which she would later understand was not an accident. Holt was attached to the Air Force Inspector General's office, a role he had moved into after his time commanding flight operations at Columbus, a role that gave him authority over operational conduct reviews and the particular power of a man who understood that paperwork properly applied was a weapon as effective as anything mounted on a wing station. He walked into Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's office at 1000 hours on day 3 and closed the door behind him. Hayes had known Holt was coming since the previous afternoon. He had said nothing to Madison because he needed to understand what Holt wanted before he decided how to position what had happened at Black Ridge Pass in the official record. This was the part of command that did not appear in leadership manuals, the navigation of institutional politics, with the lives and careers of your people as the navigational stakes. Hayes was very good at this part of command. He had needed to be. Raymond Holt said, settling into the chair across from Hayes's desk, with the ease of a man who had decided the conversation was already going his way. Gerald, Hayes said. He did not offer coffee. Your A-10 pilot, Holt said. Reed. Captain Reed, Hayes said. The correction was not accidental. Holt smiled slightly. Captain Reed, I have been reading the mission report. I assumed you had. She flew beyond bingo fuel. She did. That is a violation of standing fuel management protocols. It is a violation of standard fuel management protocols, Hayes said. In standard circumstances. The protocols do not have a clause for non-standard circumstances. The rules of engagement for troops in contact have a clause, Hayes said. Senior Controller Daniels authorized the extension. I authorized it through him. The authorization chain is documented. Holt looked at him. She also engaged targets outside her tasking order. She requested and received emergency mission authorization from Kunar Ops before engaging any target. The request and the authorization are both in the radio logs, time-stamped. Holt was quiet for a moment. Hayes watched him the way a man watches weather, not with anxiety, but with the precise attention of someone who needs to know what is coming in order to be ready for it. You covered her well, Holt said. The paperwork is clean. The paperwork reflects what happened, Hayes said. What happened, Holt said, leaning forward slightly, is that a pilot with an established pattern of independent decision-making flew a mission. She was not assigned to engage targets outside her authorization and returned with a fuel state that should have resulted in an emergency landing declaration. He paused. That is what happened, Raymond. The fact that Alpha survived does not change what she did. Hayes looked at him steadily. 4 soldiers would have died in a 4-minute coverage gap, he said, including a private who was already critical. They are alive. That is also what happened. The outcome does not justify the method. With respect, Gerald, Hayes said, and his voice dropped to something quiet and very serious. In this case, I believe it does. Holt stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to Hayes, the posture of a man deciding how much further to push. I want to speak with Captain Reed, he said. She is available at 1300, Hayes said. I will be present. Holt turned around. That is not standard protocol for an IG interview. Captain Reed is my pilot, Hayes said. 1300. My presence is not negotiable. Madison learned about the meeting at 11:30. Hayes called her into his office and told her simply and without softening it. Inspector General's office. Holt. 1300. She had 2 hours. She sat across from Hayes and absorbed the information. Do you know Major Holt? Hayes asked. Yes, sir, she said. Hayes waited. He was the commanding officer at Columbus when I made my aircraft selection, she said. He had strong opinions about my choice. Hayes looked at her. Strong opinions, he said. He threw my assignment folder at my face in front of the briefing room, she said. In front of every pilot in my class. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. You did not report that, he said. No, sir. Why not? She thought about it. Because I intended to prove him wrong instead, she said. Hayes held her gaze. Then he nodded once. At 1300, he said, you will answer his questions directly and accurately. You will not apologize for any decision you made during the Alpha mission. You will not editorialize. You will give him facts. Yes, sir. The facts are sufficient, he said. The facts are frankly extraordinary. Let them carry the weight. She stood to leave. Captain Reed, Hayes said. She stopped. He cannot touch the mission, Hayes said. The mission is documented, authorized, and successful. What he can attempt to touch is your pattern of conduct. He will try to establish that Black Ridge Pass was not an exceptional response to exceptional circumstances, but rather a symptom of a pilot who operates outside boundaries as a matter of habit. She understood. Is there anything in my record that supports that characterization? She asked. Hayes almost smiled. No, he said, there is not, but be aware that he will try to create the impression of one anyway. At 1300 hours, Madison walked into the small conference room adjacent to Hayes's office and found Major Gerald Holt sitting at the head of the table with a folder in front of him and the expression of a man who had decided the outcome of this conversation before it started. Hayes sat to one side. Madison sat across from Holt. She looked at him directly. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, the particular gaze of someone who had decided you were a category rather than a person who had filed you under a heading and was now simply confirming the filing. Captain Reed, he said. Major Holt, she said. He opened the folder. I want to walk through the events of the Black Ridge Pass mission, he said, starting with your decision to respond to the Alpha actual distress call despite not being on the assigned tasking order. I heard the distress call on the ground forces frequency I was monitoring as secondary traffic, she said. I assessed that I was the closest available asset with the appropriate weapons load and fuel state for immediate engagement. I requested emergency mission authorization through Kunar Ops before taking any action outside my training profile. At what point did you make the decision to respond? When I heard the distress call. Before you requested authorization. The decision to request authorization and the decision to respond were simultaneous, she said. I did not decide to respond and then seek cover through a request. I assessed the situation, determined I had the capability to help, and immediately sought the authorization required to do so. Holt wrote something. You then extended your station time beyond your fuel bingo state, he said. Senior Controller Daniels and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes both authorized the extension, she said. I informed them of my fuel state before making the decision. The authorization is documented. You informed them of your fuel state at that moment, Holt said. You did not inform them of the margin you were actually operating within. I gave them the accurate numbers, she said. They made the authorization decision with full information. Holt looked up. The number you gave them was your current fuel state, he said, not your projected fuel state at base arrival, given the weather deviation you encountered on the return. She paused. He was right about that. The weather deviation on the return had added approximately 7 minutes to her flight time and consumed more fuel than her straight-line calculation had accounted for. She had known that was possible when she chose to extend. She had assessed it as a manageable risk. She had not communicated that specific risk to Daniels or Hayes because the communication would have taken time she did not have and because she believed she could manage it. She had been right, but she had not communicated it. You are correct, she said. I did not communicate the specific weather deviation risk on the return. Hayes glanced at her. Holt wrote more. So you made a unilateral decision, Holt said, to accept a risk that you did not disclose to the officers who authorized your extension. I made a professional judgment call, she said, that the risk was manageable, and it was manageable. The aircraft returned to base safely. Barely. Safely, she said, the margin was tight, the outcome was not in question. At 70% confidence, Holt said, He had read the debrief. Of course he had. You told Lieutenant Colonel Hayes that your confidence of making the base was 70%. Yes. 30% chance of not making the base. Yes. Most pilots would consider 30% an unacceptable risk. Most pilots were not the only asset available to prevent 4 soldiers from dying in a coverage gap. She said. The room was very quiet. Holt put his pen down. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but existed somewhere between the two, in the territory that only forms when a man realizes the person he intended to diminish is not going to cooperate with the diminishment. Captain Reed, he said, do you understand why operational protocols exist? Yes, she said. They exist because individual judgment, without structure and accountability, produces inconsistent outcomes. They exist because the cumulative effect of many pilots making many individual judgment calls without oversight creates systemic risk. Correct, he said. They also exist, she said, because the people who wrote them understood that no protocol can anticipate every situation, which is why the rules of engagement for troops in contact include provisions for immediate response, which is why emergency mission authorization exists, which is why Senior Controller Daniels and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes have the authority to override standard protocols in exceptional circumstances. Holt picked his pen back up. You have a pattern, he said, of deciding that your judgment supersedes the established process. I have a pattern, she said, of following the established process, including the parts of the process that allow for exceptional responses to exceptional circumstances. You chose the A-10 against the recommendation of your assignment officer. I chose the A-10 within the documented process for aircraft selection, she said. My assignment officer had opinions about my choice. He was entitled to those opinions. The process allowed my choice. Holt's jaw tightened. Hayes, watching from the side, said nothing. He did not need to say anything. Madison was doing exactly what he had told her to do, giving Holt facts, letting the facts carry the weight. Major Holt, Madison said, and her voice changed slightly, became something quieter and more direct. The voice she used when she had decided that precision mattered more than diplomacy. I respect the function of the Inspector General's office. I understand why this review is occurring. But I want to be clear about something. Holt looked at her. 4 soldiers are alive today who would not be alive if I had followed standard fuel management protocol and departed station at Bingo Fuel, she said. Private Torres, who was critical when I departed, is recovering at Bagram right now. Sergeant Brooks has 14 soldiers who went home to their families instead of going home in flag-draped boxes. She paused. I made decisions under extreme time pressure, with incomplete information and imperfect options. Every decision I made was in service of the mission I was authorized to fly. If the Inspector General's office determines that my conduct requires formal review, I will participate in that review fully and without reservation. But I will not characterize what I did at Black Ridge Pass as a failure of judgment. It was the best judgment I was capable of in service of people who needed it. The room held that for a moment. Then Holt closed his folder. I will submit my findings to the IG office within 72 hours, he said. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. Reed, he said. Sir. The folder, he said. At Columbus. I should not have done that. The silence after that was the loudest thing in the room. Then he walked out. Hayes looked at Madison. She was looking at the door. Well, Hayes said quietly. Yes, sir, she said. She stood up, straightened her flight suit, and walked out. She did not allow herself to feel the weight of what had just happened until she was outside alone with the cold Afghan air against her face. Then she stood very still and breathed. The IG findings arrived in 71 hours. No formal review, no disciplinary action. A notation in the mission record recommending that the fuel extension decision-making process be documented more thoroughly in future emergency authorizations, a bureaucratic hedge that covered the office without touching the pilot. Hayes read the findings in his office and then called Madison in and read them to her without inflection. She nodded. That is it, she said. That is it, he said. She nodded again. One more thing, Hayes said. He reached across his desk and slid a single sheet of paper toward her. This arrived this morning from Sergeant Brooks. She picked it up. It was not an official communication. It was handwritten on paper torn from a field notebook, the kind of paper that had been folded 4 times and carried in a pocket and unfolded carefully. It read, Captain Reed, my name is Daniel Brooks. I am the convoy commander from Black Ridge Pass. I am writing this because I need you to know something that the official reports will not say. When your aircraft came over us the first time, I had 2 men who had stopped believing they were going to survive. Not giving up exactly. Just gone somewhere inside themselves where the math had already finished. When they heard your engine, they came back. Both of them. I watched it happen. I do not know how to explain what that sound meant to us. I do not know if you can understand it from the cockpit, but I want you to know that the sound of your aircraft coming over that valley was the sound of someone deciding we were worth coming down for. My men will carry that. I will carry that. Whatever you flew and whatever they said about you before, you were the right pilot in the right aircraft on the right day. With respect and gratitude, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, U.S. Army. Madison read it once. Then she folded it exactly as Brooks had folded it 4 times and put it in her flight suit pocket next to the medical status report she had been carrying for 3 days. Hayes watched her. He is being recommended for a decoration, Hayes said, for his leadership during the ambush. He deserves it, she said. So do you, Hayes said. She looked at him. The commendation I approved after the debrief, he said. I am upgrading it. I am recommending the Distinguished Flying Cross. She was quiet. Sir, she said, you do not need to say anything, he said. It is a recommendation. It will go through channels. It will take time, he paused, but it will go through. She nodded. She stood to leave. Captain Reed, Hayes said. She stopped. Major Holt's comment at the end of the meeting about the folder at Columbus. She waited. In 23 years, Hayes said, I have never heard Gerald Holt apologize for anything. She held that for a moment. People surprise you, she said. Yes, Hayes said. They do. 2 days later, she was back in the air. The A-10 had passed its full inspection. Rodriguez had personally signed off on every system, and when Madison walked into the maintenance bay at 0500 for her pre-flight check, she found him already there, running a final visual on the cannon system, with the focused attention of someone who had been awake for a while. You do not need to be here this early, she said. I know, he said. He kept working. She did her pre-flight. They worked around each other in the maintenance bay, the way people work around each other when they have developed a mutual understanding that does not require narration. He knew what she needed to check. She knew where he was going to be. They moved without collision and without comment. When she finished and climbed into the cockpit, he stood on the ladder beside the aircraft, the way he always did for engine start. Rodriguez, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. He knew she was not talking about the inspection. He nodded once. Then he climbed down and pulled the ladder away, and she started the engines, and the A-10 came alive around her the way it always came alive, loud and definitive and entirely without apology. And she taxied out onto the runway and lifted into the Afghan morning. The training mission that day was unremarkable, but the sky felt different to her now. Not safer, not easier, just more honest. The way a road feels different after you have driven it in conditions that showed you what it was actually capable of. She flew the training profile with a precision and filed her debrief and ate dinner alone in the chow hall and read the maintenance schedule for the next week and did all the ordinary things that pilots do in the spaces between the extraordinary ones. Captain Holloway sat down across from her at dinner without asking. She looked up. He had a tray in the expression of a man who had made a decision and was going to follow through with it, regardless of reception. You mind, he said. No, she said. He sat down and started eating. They ate in silence for a while. Then he said Holt came to the squadron before he left. She looked at him. He talked to a few of us, Holloway said. About the mission, about you. He paused. I think he was trying to build a case. He was asking about your habits, whether you followed protocols, whether you had a pattern of independent action. What did you tell him? She said. Holloway put his fork down. I told him, he said, that in my observation, Captain Reed followed protocols precisely and thoroughly, including the protocols that authorized exceptional responses to exceptional circumstances, and that the Black Ridge Pass mission was a demonstration of exactly the kind of judgment the Air Force should want its pilots to exercise. She looked at him. He picked his fork back up. I also told him, Holloway said that the mountain goat joke was mine and not representative of the squadron's assessment of Captain Reed's capabilities. Something moved through her that was not quite amusement and not quite gratitude, but lived close to both of them. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he said, "I did not have to." He kept eating. She kept eating. Around them, the chow hall filled with the noise of a military base at the end of a long day. The particular sound of people who lived close to serious things, allowing themselves to be ordinary for an hour. Madison ate her dinner and thought about Torres recovering in the ward. She thought about Brooks's letter folded in her pocket. She thought about Rodriguez arriving before dawn to make sure the aircraft was right. She thought about Holloway telling Holt that the mountain goat joke was his. She thought about the moment the A-10 cannon had opened up over the North Ridgeline and the entire mountain had shaken, and Brooks had looked up and whispered that she had come down. She had chosen this, not the danger, not the difficulty, not the institutional resistance, or Holt's folder thrown at her face, or the laughter in the briefing room at Columbus. She had chosen the thing underneath all of that. The thing her father had tried to describe when he talked about machines and the people who ran them, honestly. The commitment to the transaction. To be where the soldiers needed her to be. To come down. The A-10 was back in the maintenance bay, serviced and ready, and waiting for the next call that would demand everything she had. And somewhere in the eastern mountains, in the places where maps ended and the real country began, soldiers were moving through terrain that was trying to kill them, and they were moving with something they had not had before Black Ridge Pass. They had heard the cannon. They had heard the engine coming over. They knew that somewhere above the clouds, there was a pilot who had looked at the math and the fuel gauge and the 45-minute timeline and made a different calculation. They knew that Angel was real. And that knowledge, the bone-deep animal knowledge that someone had chosen to come down, was going to carry them through things that the knowledge alone could not have carried them through before. Madison Reed finished her dinner. She carried her tray to the return window. She walked back to her quarters in the cold Afghan night. And the next morning she would wake before dawn and go to the maintenance bay and check on her aircraft and climb into the cockpit and lift into the sky. And she would do this because it was the thing she had chosen. And because the choosing had never once felt like a mistake. Not on the day she chose it. Not when the room laughed, not when Holt threw the folder, not when the fuel gauge said impossible and she said manageable. Not ever. The distinguished flying cross recommendation moved through channels the way everything moved through channels, slowly, with the particular friction of a bureaucracy that was built to be thorough rather than fast. Hayes had submitted it. It had been acknowledged. It would take weeks, possibly months, and during those weeks and months, the 74th Fighter Squadron continued its operational tempo. And Madison continued flying, and the war continued, being exactly what it had always been, patient and indifferent, and entirely unconcerned with the decorations or the politics or the Inspector General's findings of the people fighting inside it. 3 weeks after Black Ridge Pass, two things happened on the same day. Private First Class Marcus Torres walked out of the Bagram Medical Facility under his own power, for the first time leaning on a cane, accompanied by a nurse who stayed 2 steps behind him, with the careful attention of someone who had watched him fight his way back from the edge and was not yet entirely ready to stop watching. He walked 30 meters down the corridor and then stopped and sat down in a chair by the window and looked out at the flight line for a long time without moving. And at approximately the same hour that Torres was sitting in that chair, a signals intelligence report landed on Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' desk that changed the operational picture for the entire Eastern Corridor. Hayes read it twice. Then he called his senior pilots into the operations center. Madison was among them. The report was classified at a level that required Hayes to summarize rather than distribute, which he did, standing at the front of the room with the particular economy of a man who had learned that the most important information was always the information you could say in the fewest possible words. "There is a command and control node," he said, "operating out of a position in the Korengal Valley. It has been coordinating attack operations against coalition forces in the Eastern Corridor for the past 4 months. Based on signals intelligence and pattern of life analysis, we now assess with high confidence that this node was responsible for the targeting intelligence behind the Black Ridge Pass ambush." The room was very still. It was also responsible for 2 previous ambushes in the same corridor that resulted in 11 coalition casualties over the past 6 weeks. Madison looked at the map Hayes indicated. The Korengal Valley was not a place where easy missions happened. It was a narrow, steep-walled valley that had been the site of some of the hardest fighting of the entire war. The terrain there was not simply difficult. It was the kind of terrain that seemed to actively participate in the killing that gave the enemy every possible advantage of elevation and concealment and made every approach by ground or air a problem requiring specific solutions rather than general ones. "We have a targeting package," Hayes said. "The mission is a precision strike against the node location. We have 2 aircraft assigned, Viper 1 and Viper 2. He paused. "The strike window is narrow. Weather in the valley is expected to be marginal at best. We have a 15-minute window tomorrow morning at 0600 before conditions deteriorate." He looked around the room. Captain Holloway raised his hand. "Sir, what is the target depth? Is the node in a position where F-16s can work it effectively?" Hayes looked at the map again. "The node is in a structure approximately 40 meters from a residential compound," he said. "The strike requires precision delivery. The F-16s have the targeting package. The mission is assigned." He closed the briefing. Madison said nothing during the meeting. She said nothing afterward when the other pilots filtered out, and she remained for a moment looking at the map that Hayes had left up on the board. She was not second-guessing the mission assignment. The F-16s were the right tool for a precision strike. She knew that. She was looking at the terrain around the target, the valley walls, the approach corridors, the position of the residential compound relative to the target structure. Running the geometry in her mind, the way she ran everything in her mind, automatically the way breathing is automatic. Hayes saw her looking. "Something," what he said. "The approach corridor for the strike," she said. "If the weather is marginal, the F-16s will be working from altitude. The targeting system should handle the precision requirement." "Yes," Hayes said. "But if the weather forces a lower approach," she said, "the valley walls will constrain their maneuvering envelope significantly." "The weather forecast has them comfortably above that threshold," Hayes said. "Yes, sir," she said. She walked out. But she went back to her quarters and pulled out the topographic detail for the Korengal Valley that she had downloaded to her tablet 3 weeks earlier. Not for this mission, simply because she made a habit of knowing the terrain in her operational area, the way her father had made a habit of knowing every machine in his shop, not because you needed the information immediately, but because the day you needed it would not announce itself in advance. She studied it for 2 hours. Then she went to sleep. At 04:30, the next morning, her radio woke her. It was Hayes. "Reed, get to the operations center. Now." She was dressed and moving in 90 seconds. The operations center was already occupied when she arrived. Hayes was there. Holloway was there. The 2 F-16 pilots assigned to the Viper mission, Captain Sarah Chen and Lieutenant Ryan Park, were there, both of them in flight suits. Both of them with the particular expression of pilots who have just received information that has changed their morning. The weather had moved, not by a little. The Korengal Valley was socked in completely. A storm system that the forecast had placed 40 kilometers south had tracked north and west faster than predicted and was now sitting directly over the target area with cloud bases at 200 meters and visibility near zero. The 15-minute strike window at 0600 no longer existed. "We have a problem," Hayes said. He did not waste time establishing that. "The weather closes the window for this morning. The intelligence assessment gives the node a 48-hour relocation probability of 80% if we do not act, which means if we miss this window, we likely lose the target entirely." He looked at the weather display. "The storm is moving. There is a possible secondary window this afternoon. Estimated duration 10 to 15 minutes. Cloud bases may lift to 300 meters during that window." Chen spoke first. "Sir, 300 meters is below our minimum release altitude for the precision munitions package we are carrying. We cannot hit the target from that altitude without unacceptable risk to the residential compound." "I know," Hayes said. "What about rescheduling with a different munitions load?" Park said. "The 48-hour relocation probability," Hayes said. "By the time we reschedule and rebrief, we are looking at a mission 24 hours from now at the earliest. The node will likely have moved." The room was quiet. Madison had been standing at the back of the room since she arrived. She had not spoken. Now Hayes looked directly at her. She already knew what he was going to say. The A-10 can work at 300 meters, he said. It was not a question. The A-10 can work at 300 meters, she confirmed. The target requires precision, he said. 40 meters from a residential compound. I know, she said. That is not a margin that forgives error. I know, sir. Chen and Park are more experienced with this specific target type, he said. Their munitions require an altitude that the weather will not give them today, she said. My munitions and my platform do not have that constraint. Hayes looked at her. Chen looked at her. Park was looking at the weather display, running his own calculations, arriving at the same place Hayes had already arrived. Walk me through it, Hayes said. She walked to the map. She had spent 2 hours the previous night studying this terrain. She did not need to study it now. She spoke from the picture in her head, the one she had built through years of the particular attention that turned flat information into three-dimensional understanding. The eastern approach corridor gives me a clean attack angle on the target structure. Valley walls on the north and south constrain my maneuvering, but do not prohibit the approach. At 300-meter ceiling, I have a workable release window using the cannon for primary engagement. I can confirm visual identification of the target structure against the residential compound before I fire. The 40-meter separation is tight, but it is within the accuracy profile of the system at that range. You will be inside small arms range for the entire approach, Hayes said. Yes, sir. The node is a command and control facility. It will have protection. Yes, sir. This is not Black Ridge Pass, Hayes said. Black Ridge Pass was a response to troops in contact. This is a deliberate strike against a defended target, different risk profile. I understand, sir. He studied her. You are not assigned to this mission, he said. No, sir, she said. I am available for this mission. Hayes turned to Chen. Captain Chen Tong, he said. Your assessment. Chen looked at Madison for a moment. Then she looked at Hayes. If the ceiling lifts to 300 meters, she said carefully, and if Angel can visually confirm target separation before engagement, the approach geometry she described as viable. She paused. I would not want to fly it, but the geometry is viable. Hayes turned back to Madison. I need 30 minutes, he said. Go to maintenance. Make sure your aircraft is configured for the mission. Do not launch until I give you the word. Yes, sir, she said. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Hayes start talking to Chen about the backup targeting package in the event that the weather did not cooperate even for the A-10. She did not listen to that conversation. She went to the maintenance bay and found Rodriguez already awake, already working, already aware that something was happening, because something was always happening, and Rodriguez had developed a sense for when the something involved his aircraft and his pilot. What do we need, he said, she told him. He moved without comment. Adoki Nini 100 Hayes gave her the word. The weather was not ideal. It was never going to be ideal. But the storm was behaving in the way Hayes's meteorological officer had predicted for the afternoon window, a temporary and partial lift in the cloud bases that would not last and would not be comfortable, but would give an aircraft capable of working at 300 meters a narrow channel through which something could be accomplished. Madison launched at 09:15. The flight to the Korengal Valley took 18 minutes. She spent those 18 minutes doing what she always did on the approach to something serious, running the problem in its entirety, allowing herself to see every dimension of it clearly without flinching from the ones that were dangerous, the valley walls that would eliminate her escape options, on the approach to the ground fire that the node's protection force would direct toward a low and slow aircraft that they would hear coming long before it arrived, the 40-meter margin between the target structure and the people in the residential compound who had nothing to do with the war being fought around them. She thought about that last element carefully. It was the element that mattered most. She could accept risk to herself with complete equanimity. She had made that accommodation long ago, but the residential compound was not a risk she was accepting on her own behalf. The accuracy of the GAU-8 at the range and angle her approach would require was well within the documented performance parameters of the system. She knew those parameters. She had read the technical manuals and the field reports and the post-mission analyses of every similar engagement she could find. The system could do it. She had to trust the system and her execution of it. She keyed her radio. Kunar Ops Angel Flight, I am 15 minutes from target area, requesting confirmation of current weather at objective. Angel Flight, Kunar Ops. Cloud base at objective is currently 320 meters. Holding steady for the past 12 minutes. Wind from the northwest at 12 knots. 320 meters, 20 meters above what she needed. Not a gift, but enough. Copies, she said. Angel flight is inbound. Swim. She heard the ground fire before she entered the valley. Not the crack of individual weapons. The sound that reached her was deeper, the sound of crew-served weapons, a heavy machine gun positioned on the valley floor, tracking her approach with the practiced patience of fighters who had spent years learning how coalition aircraft behaved and how to make that behavior costly. She did not change her approach angle. Changing her approach angle would mean changing her attack geometry, and the attack geometry was the one element of this mission that she had no margin to compromise. She came in along the eastern corridor exactly as she had described to Hayes. The valley walls rose on either side of her, and the cloud base sat above her like a ceiling, and she was flying in the space between them with the particular concentration of someone who has accepted that the only way through a problem is directly through it. She identified the target structure at 800 meters. She confirmed the residential compound at 40 meters to the north. She confirmed there was no movement in the target structure's immediate perimeter that suggested non-combatants. Then she armed the cannon. The ground fire intensified. She heard the rounds going past the aircraft, felt the aircraft shudder once as something hit the outer wing surface. Nothing structural, nothing that changed what she was doing, but the specific physical confirmation that this was real and that the margin for error was exactly what Hayes had told her it was. She fired at 400 meters. The cannon ran for 1.8 seconds. The target structure ceased to exist. The residential compound stood. She pulled up hard and climbed for the cloud base and broke through it into the gray above and kept climbing until she was at an altitude where the ground fire could no longer reach her, and then she leveled off and checked her systems and ran through the damage assessment for the wing hit and found nothing that compromised flight safety. Shakid, her radio. Kunar Ops Angel Flight. Target is destroyed. I have minor damage to the outer left wing. No flight safety issues. I am returning to base. The response took a moment. Then Daniels came on. Angel Flight Kunar Ops. Battle damage assessment confirms target destroyed. No collateral damage to surrounding structures. A pause. Good work, Angel. She did not respond to that. She turned the aircraft west and flew home. Hayes was waiting on the flight line when she landed. She taxied in and shut down the engines and climbed out, and Rodriguez was already on the wing surface, looking at the outer wing damage before she had both feet on the ground. Hayes walked up to her. He looked at her for a moment. Target destroyed, she said. Minor wing damage. All systems nominal. He nodded. Then he said, the ground fire, the heavy machine gun on the valley floor. Our signals intelligence team picked up radio traffic from that position approximately 40 seconds after you completed your attack run. She waited. They were reporting your aircraft as destroyed, he said. She processed that. They missed, she said. They thought they hadn't, he said. They reported a confirmed kill on the attacking aircraft. That report went up their chain of command. She understood the implication. An enemy command and control network that believed it had shot down the attacking aircraft would process that as a significant success. It would also eventually learn it was wrong. How long before they correct the report, she said. Intelligence assesses between 12 and 36 hours, Hayes said, before someone in their network puts it together that the aircraft landed safely. She nodded. During that window, Hayes said, their network will be celebrating a kill they did not make and not repositioning the node replacement they would otherwise be establishing. She looked at him. It gives us a window, he said, to follow up on the intelligence that was associated with the node before they go back to operational security protocols. That is not my operational lane, she said. No, he said, it is not, but I wanted you to understand the full picture of what you accomplished today. He paused. The mission you flew just now was not a solo act. The intelligence people, the planners, Chen and Park, who would have flown it if the weather had permitted, Rodriguez and his crew, the controller, who gave you the weather update in real time. You were the trigger, but the whole machine was behind you. She looked at him. I know, sir, she said. Do you, he said, not unkindly. She thought about that. Yes, she said, I know. Rodriguez came down from the wing surface. Outer wing panel took 2 hits, he said. Clean penetrations, no structural compromise. I can have her patched in 6 hours. 6 hours, Hayes repeated. Yes, sir, Rodriguez said. Hayes looked at Madison. Get some food, he said. You debrief at 1400. She nodded. She started toward the operations center. Reed, Hayes said. She stopped. The residential compound, he said. You had 40 meters. Yes, sir. How confident were you in the system? She thought about the technical manuals, the field reports, the post-mission analyses, the 2 hours she had spent the previous night with topographic detail, and the particular attention she brought to everything that mattered. 100% confident in the system, she said. And in yourself, she was quiet for a moment. 95, she said. Hayes nodded. That 5%, he said. That is what separates a professional from someone who is simply fearless. She walked to the operations center. The debrief at 1400 is attended by every pilot in the 74th who was not currently in the air. This was not standard protocol for a single aircraft mission debrief. Hayes had not ordered it, but word had moved through the squadron the way it always moved fast and ahead of any formal communication. And when pilots heard what had happened in the Korengal Valley that morning, they came to the debrief, the way people go to something they understand instinctively they should witness. Madison gave her account the same way she always gave her accounts. Precise, sequential, without drama and without diminishment. Approach geometry, target identification engagement, damage, departure. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Chen raised her hand. I want to ask about the valley walls, she said. At the point where you committed to the approach, your maneuvering options, if you had needed to abort, were what exactly limited, Madison said. How limited? Realistically, I had one exit option. Back out the eastern corridor the way I came in. Through the ground fire, Chen said. Through the ground fire, Madison confirmed. So you committed to the approach knowing that if anything changed in the target picture that required you to abort your exit was back through an active firing position. Yes, Chen looked at her. Why, she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. Because the alternative was not attempting the mission at all, Madison said. And the mission needed to happen today, not tomorrow, today. You could have said that to Colonel Hayes and he would have found another option, Chen said. There was no other option with the weather and the relocation timeline, Madison said. We all knew that in the operations center at 0430. The geometry I described to the colonel was the geometry. There was not a version of this mission that did not include that approach corridor. Chen nodded slowly. Park said, I would not have flown it. The room turned toward him. I was not saying it as a criticism. He was saying it as a statement of honest self-assessment, the kind of thing that takes a particular kind of confidence to say out loud in a room full of pilots. I do not mean that as a criticism of the decision to fly it, he said. I mean it as an honest statement about my own limits. I would have found a reason not to fly that approach. I would have found a reason that sounded legitimate and tactical. But underneath it, the reason would have been that I was not willing to accept what that approach required. He looked at Madison. You were willing, he said. The room held that. Hayes did not comment on it. He closed the debrief folder. Mission is complete, he said. Target is destroyed. Pilot and aircraft return safely. That is the outcome. He stood, dismissed. The room emptied. Madison was the last one out, as she usually was taking a moment to make sure she had not left anything. The habit of someone who had been careful long enough that carefulness had become instinct. Holloway was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside her as she walked. Park was right, he said. About what, she said. About what he would have done, Holloway said. I was sitting there listening to him say it and thinking me too. I would have found a reason. Holloway, she said. I am not saying this to compliment you, he said. I am saying it because I think it matters to understand it. There is a difference between courage and willingness. Courage is feeling the fear and acting anyway. Willingness is something else. It is deciding in advance what you are available for. You decided a long time ago, before Columbus, before the assignment board, you decided what you were available for, and you have been executing that decision ever since. She walked without speaking for a moment. My father used to say, she said finally, that a machine is only as honest as the person running it. Holloway looked at her. He meant, she said, that you cannot run something well if you are not honest with yourself about what it requires. They walked in silence. Then Holloway said, "What does the A-10 require?" She thought about it. She thought about the sound of the cannon in a narrow valley. She thought about fuel gauges past bingo and weather at 300 meters and 40-meter margins in the red smoke rising crooked from the valley floor. She thought about Torres walking out of the medical facility on a cane. She thought about Brooks's letter folded 4 times in her flight suit pocket. It requires someone who has decided, she said, that the people on the ground are worth whatever it costs to reach them. Holloway nodded. He stopped walking. She kept going. Behind her, she heard him say quietly enough that she might not have been meant to hear it. Then it found the right pilot. She did not turn around, but she carried it with her, the same way she carried the letter, the same way she carried Torres's name, the same way she carried all the things that did not fit into official records but were the actual substance of what had happened and what it meant. That evening, Rodriguez stopped her on her way out of the maintenance bay. "Wing repair is done," he said. "She will fly tomorrow." "Good," she said. He handed her something. It was a photograph, a printout slightly blurry, the kind that came off a base printer not designed for images. It showed a group of soldiers, 12 of them, standing in front of an armored vehicle. They were not in formation. They were simply standing together the way people stand when they want to document a moment rather than perform one. In the center of the group, Sergeant Daniel Brooks held a handmade sign. The sign said, "Angel Flight, we are standing because of you." Madison looked at the photograph for a long time. "How did you get this?" she said. "Brooks sent it to Hayes," Rodriguez said. "Hayes gave it to me, said I should give it to you." She looked at the 12 men in the photograph. She looked at the sign. She looked at Brooks's face, at the particular expression of a soldier who has survived something serious and is standing on the other side of it and wants someone who was not there to understand what it means to be standing. She folded the photograph carefully. She put it in her flight suit pocket. Next to the letter, next to the medical status report. "Rodriguez," she said. "Ma'am." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She walked out into the Afghan night. Above her, the sky was clear and cold and enormous, the kind of sky that made everything beneath it seem both very small and very specific, every particular thing standing out in sharp relief against the vastness around it. She walked back to her quarters. She was tired in the specific way that comes from doing something that demanded everything and finding that everything was enough. Tomorrow the aircraft would fly. Tomorrow there would be a mission brief and a weather assessment and a frequency to monitor and a fuel state to manage. Tomorrow the war would continue being what it had always been. And somewhere in the eastern mountains, in places where the stars were the same stars she was looking at right now, soldiers would be moving through terrain that was trying to kill them, moving with the knowledge that had settled into their bones at Black Ridge Pass and would never entirely leave. That angel was real, that she would come, that someone had looked at the math in the fuel gauge, in the valley walls, in the 40-meter margin, and decided that the people on the ground were worth whatever it cost. Madison Reed went to sleep, and the aircraft waited in the maintenance bay, fully repaired, fully fueled, ready for whatever the morning required. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived on a Tuesday, not with ceremony, not with advance notice. It arrived the way important things sometimes arrive, quietly in a manila envelope on Hayes's desk, processed through channels that had taken 11 weeks to complete their work. Hayes read the authorization letter, set it down, picked up his phone, and called Madison's quarters at 0700. She answered on the second ring. "Report to my office at 0800, he said. "Dress uniform." She knew what it meant. She had not allowed herself to think about it directly during the 11 weeks since Hayes had submitted the recommendation. Thinking about it would have introduced a kind of anticipation that she did not want shaping her daily work, a forward lean that could throw off the balance she had spent years building. So she had not thought about it. She had flown her missions and checked her aircraft and read her maintenance reports and eaten her meals with Holloway and listened to Rodriguez talk about the fuel system calibration he was running on the engine and not thought about the envelope moving through channels. Now she stood in front of her locker and put on her dress uniform with the particular care of someone who understood that the uniform was not about her. It was about the institution she served and the people she served within it, in the specific formality of moments that needed to be marked, because unmarked, they would simply pass and be forgotten. She reported to Hayes' office at 0800 exactly. Hayes was in his own dress uniform. Holloway was there. Chen was there. Park was there. Rodriguez was there, which surprised her, standing slightly apart from the pilots, with the straight posture of an enlisted man who has been told to be present at something formal and has decided to be more formal than anyone in the room. And standing beside Hayes's desk in the dress uniform of the United States Army was Sergeant Daniel Brooks. Madison stopped in the doorway. Brooks looked at her. I was thinner than she had imagined him, from the voice on the radio, and the handwriting in the letter, in the blurry photograph. He had the face of a man who had been through serious things and had come out the other side without pretending the things had not happened. There were lines in his face that were not age lines. They were experience lines. She recognized them because she had started to see them in her own face and in the faces of everyone around her who had been here long enough. Captain Reed, Hayes said, I believe you know Sergeant Brooks. I know his voice, she said. This is the first time I have seen his face. Brooks stepped forward. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and direct and lasted exactly the right amount of time, long enough to mean something, short enough to be honest. I wanted to be here, he said. I requested permission from my commanding officer 3 weeks ago. Colonel Hayes was kind enough to facilitate. She looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the wall. She looked back at Brooks. You did not need to come, she said. No, he said. I did not need to. That is why I came. Hayes cleared his throat. The ceremony was brief. Hayes read the citation, which had been written by someone in a headquarters office who had not been present for any of it, but had processed the after-action reports, in the debrief transcripts, in the radio logs, and had assembled from those documents a description of events that was accurate in every particular, and somehow still did not quite capture the specific texture of what had happened over Black Ridge Pass on that morning 11 weeks ago. Madison stood and listened to the citation being read about herself, with the slight unreality of hearing your own actions described in the third person, by language that was correct, but felt like it was describing someone slightly adjacent to you. Then Hayes pinned the distinguished flying cross to her dress uniform. He stepped back. He saluted her. She returned the salute. The room was quiet. Then Brooks said, without ceremony and without warning, Private Torres wanted me to tell you something. Everyone in the room turned toward him. He is back with his unit, Brooks said. He went through 8 weeks of physical therapy. He walks without a cane now. He told me to tell you that he has a daughter. She was born 4 months after Black Ridge Pass. He named her Madison. The room was completely still. Hayes looked at the wall again. Rodriguez made a sound that was not quite a cough. Madison stood with the distinguished flying cross on her chest and the photograph in her flight suit pocket, and the letter that she had read so many times. The fold lines were wearing through, and looked at Sergeant Daniel Brooks, this man whose voice she had known and whose face she was learning, and could not find the right words for a moment. Then she said, Is she healthy? Brooks smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his face completely, opened it up into something younger and less complicated. She is loud, he said. Torres says she has opinions about everything. Good, Madison said. She should. The reception after the ceremony was informal. The kind that happens naturally when people who have been through something together find themselves in the same room without a formal agenda, when the ceremony is done and what remains is simply the being together. Hayes produced a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer with the air of a man who had been keeping it for a specific occasion and had decided this was the occasion. He poured for everyone, including Rodriguez, who accepted his glass with the dignity of a man who understood that some moments transcended the usual organizational hierarchy. Brooks sat with Madison at the edge of the room. They had not run out of things to say. They had simply arrived at the point where the things that needed to be said could be said quietly and without performance. My men ask about you, Brooks said. Not all of them, most of them. They want to know if you are still flying. I am still flying, she said. I will tell them, he said. She turned her glass in her hands. Merritt, she said. Private Merritt, the young one. He was crying when he didn't know it. Is he all right? Brooks looked at her. How do you know about Merritt? I was watching you from altitude, she said. Before I came down for the first run, I had eyes on the convoy. I could see your men's posture, where they were positioned, who was moving and who had gone still. She paused. One of your men had gone very still in a way that was different from taking cover. That is the way people go still when they have gone inside themselves. Brooks was quiet for a moment. Merritt is fine, he said. He had a hard few weeks after. Talked to someone. He is good now. He paused. He told me he heard your engine coming over and it felt like a hand on his shoulder. She looked at her glass. A hand on his shoulder, she said. That is what he said. She nodded slowly. Sergeant Brooks, she said. Daniel, he said. She looked at him. Daniel, she said, I need to tell you something. All right. When I extended my station time past bingo fuel, she said, I had a 70% confidence level that I would make the base. I told Colonel Hayes 70% when he asked me directly in the debrief. Brooks waited. What I did not tell him, she said, was that the 70% was optimistic. The weather deviation I hit on the return dropped that number in real time. There were approximately 4 minutes on the flight home where the honest number was closer to 55. The room around them was full of other conversations. Nobody was listening to this one. Brooks looked at her steadily. Why are you telling me this, he said. Because you came here, she said. Because Torres named his daughter Madison. Because Merritt said it felt like a hand on his shoulder. And because you deserve to know that what happened that day was not a controlled, calculated execution of a perfect plan. It was someone making the best decisions she could with incomplete information and imperfect options and accepting consequences she could not fully predict. I know that, Brooks said. Do you? Captain Reed, and he said, and his voice was very quiet and very serious. I have been in the Army for 14 years. I have never in my life made a decision in combat that I was fully in control of. The ones that worked out were the ones where someone made the best call they could with what they had. The ones that did not work out were sometimes also those. The difference is not control. The difference is whether someone was willing to make the call at all. She looked at him. You made the call, he said, every time. That is what my men carry. Not the idea of a perfect pilot executing a perfect plan. The reality of someone who looked at the situation and said, I am going to do what needs to be done and figure out the rest while I am doing it. The room was warm around them. Holloway was talking to Chen about something that was making Chen laugh, a real laugh, the kind that caught her by surprise. Rodriguez was standing with Park, and they were talking with the focused attention of men who had discovered an unexpected shared interest. Hayes was sitting at his desk within view of the room, nominally doing paperwork, actually watching everything with the satisfied attention of a man presiding over something he had helped build. I have a question, Madison said. Ask it, Brooks said. The sign, she said. In the photograph, who made it? Brooks's expression changed. Merritt, he said. She nodded. He made it the same day, Brooks said. We were still in the valley waiting for QRF, and I turned around and Merritt had found a piece of cardboard from somewhere, and he was writing on it with a marker he must have had in his kit. I asked him what he was doing. Brooks paused. He said he wanted Angel to know we were standing. She was quiet. He spelled your call sign wrong the first time, Brooks said. He crossed it out and started over. Something moved through her that she did not try to name. It lived below language the way important things often do in the territory of the body rather than the mind. A warmth in the chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey and everything to do with a 22-year-old soldier with tear tracks drying on his face, deciding that what mattered most in that moment was making sure the pilot knew. Tell him, she said finally. Tell him what? Tell him I have the photograph, she said, in my flight suit pocket. I have carried it since Rodriguez gave it to me. Tell him I look at it. Brooks looked at her for a long time. I will tell him, he said. Brooks left at 1400 hours to catch his transport back to his unit. Madison walked with him to the vehicle. They stood for a moment in the cold air, the particular cold of an Afghan afternoon that carried in it a quality of absolute clarity, the kind of cold that made everything feel very specific and very real. If it ever happens again, Brooks said, if we are ever in a valley and everything goes wrong, I want Angel on the radio. I will be on the radio, she said. He nodded. I extended his hand again. She shook it. He got in the vehicle and it drove away. She stood and watched it until it disappeared. Then she went back inside. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Hayes called her into his office for a different reason. She had known something was coming. She had felt it in the slight shift in Hayes's manner over the preceding days, the way he watched her in briefings with an attention that was slightly different from his usual attention, as though he was measuring something rather than simply observing it. She sat across from his desk. He had a folder. He opened it. There is a position, he said, at the weapons school at Nellis. They are developing a new close air support curriculum. The program needs someone who can not only teach the technical elements, but who can teach the judgment elements, the decision-making under pressure, the management of risk when the textbook does not cover the specific situation you are in. She looked at him. They asked me for a recommendation, he said. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, she said. I told them I needed time, he said, because recommending you for that position means losing you from the 74th. And losing you from the 74th has operational consequences that I was not prepared to accept without being certain the recommendation was right. She waited. I am certain, he said. She looked at the folder. The pilots who come through that curriculum, Hayes said, will go to squadrons across the Air Force. They will fly close air support. They will be in valleys like Black Ridge Pass, in situations like the Korengal strike. What they know about judgment and decision-making will come in part from whoever teaches them at the weapons school. She understood. You want me to teach, she said. I want you to multiply, he said. She sat with that for a moment. Multiply, it was precisely the right word, and she recognized that immediately. Not replicate because you could not replicate a person or a set of experiences. Not clone because the point was not to produce pilots who made the same decisions she made. Multiply. To take the understanding that had been built through Columbus and Black Ridge Pass in the Korengal Valley, and the Fuel Gauge Pass Bingo, and Torres's daughter named Madison and Merritt's cardboard sign, and Rodriguez's pre-dawn inspections, and Holloway's honesty about his own limits, to take all of that and find a way to transmit the essential thing inside it to pilots who had not yet had those experiences, but who would someday find themselves in a valley with the math running out and a choice to make. What would I be teaching? She said. Officially, Hayes said close air support tactics, techniques, and procedures. Advanced employment of the A-10 in complex threat environments. Decision-making under degraded conditions. And unofficially, she said. What it means to come down, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. I've been flying for 23 years, he said. I have had exactly 2 pilots in my command who understood at a bone level, not as a principle, but as a practice, what it actually costs to put your aircraft where the soldiers need it to be and what it actually means to accept that cost without flinching. He paused. One of them retired 3 years ago. The other one is sitting across my desk. She was quiet for a long time. If I take this position, she said, I am not flying combat. Not regularly, he said. The weapons school does fly operational missions as part of their curriculum, but your primary contribution would be in the classroom and in the training environment. The 74th would need a replacement A-10 pilot. Yes. Rodriguez would have to break in someone new on the aircraft. Hayes almost smiled. Rodriguez will survive. She thought about the maintenance bay at 0500 and the pre-dawn inspections, and the 2 of them working around each other without collision and without comment. She thought about what it would mean to go back to Nellis and stand in front of a room full of pilots and try to teach the thing that mattered most, the thing that could not be put entirely into a manual or a procedure or a numbered list of decision points. She thought about the pilot who would eventually replace her in the 74th, someone she would never meet, someone who would climb into an A-10 and monitor the ground forces frequency and hear a distress call from a valley where soldiers were running out of options. Someone who would have to decide in real time with incomplete information and imperfect choices what they were available for. What that pilot knew in that moment would come from somewhere. It could come from Madison. When do they need an answer? She said. End of the week, Hayes said. She nodded. She stood up. Sir, she said. Captain Reed. You said 2 pilots, she said. In 23 years. Who was the other one? Hayes looked at her. A man named Colonel Arthur Webb, he said. He flew the A-10 in the first Gulf War. He is the reason the Air Force did not retire the aircraft in 1993 when the first serious retirement proposal came through. He testified before the Armed Services Committee. He brought with him the after-action reports from every ground unit the A-10 had supported. He read the names of soldiers who were alive because the aircraft had been willing to come down. She absorbed that. What happened to him, she said. He retired, Hayes said. He teaches high school history in Colorado. A pause. He writes letters to the Armed Services Committee every time a new A-10 retirement proposal comes through. She nodded. I will have an answer by end of the week, she said. She walked out. Damn. She gave Hayes her answer in 3 days. Not because she had made the decision quickly. Because the decision had already been made before Hayes opened the folder, before he said the word multiply, before the ceremony, and Brooks's handshake in Torres's daughter's name. It had been made in the sequence of decisions that began at Columbus, at the assignment board, and continued through every mission and every choice since. She had decided long ago what she was available for. The weapons school was simply the next expression of it. She said yes. She had 2 weeks remaining in her deployment at Bagram. She flew every day those 2 weeks. She flew with the particular attention of someone who is not saying goodbye because goodbye implies an ending. And this was not an ending, but who understands that a chapter is closing and wants to be fully present in it while it remains open. Rodriguez knew she was leaving before she told him. He had known from the day after the ceremony, from some combination of the way Hayes had looked at her during the debrief that followed, in the particular quality of Madison's attention to the aircraft in the days that followed, an attention that had taken on a slightly different texture, more deliberate, as though she was registering things she wanted to remember. He said nothing until 3 days before her departure. I was doing a routine engine check when she came into the maintenance bay for her pre-flight, and he said, without looking up from the engine, Nellis, she said. He nodded. He kept working. After her pre-flight, he handed her the inspection log the way he always did, and she signed it the way she always did, and they went through the normal sequence of a morning before a training flight. But when she was in the cockpit and he was on the ladder for engine start, he said, the pilot they send me next. Yes, she said. Tell them, he said, that this aircraft requires someone willing to run it honest. She looked at him. He was repeating her words back to her, her father's words. The thing she had said to Holloway the night after the Korengal mission, walking back through the base in the cold. He had heard it. He had been carrying it. I will tell them, she said. He climbed down and pulled the ladder away and she started the engines. The A-10 came alive around her one more time with its particular voice loud and definitive and entirely without apology. And she taxied out and lifted into the Afghan sky and flew for 2 hours over terrain she had memorized and trusted, and that had tested her in ways she would spend the rest of her career trying to teach. When she landed and taxied back in and shut down the engines, she sat in the cockpit for a moment longer than usual, not out of sentiment, out of honesty. She wanted to know what she was feeling so that she could carry it accurately forward the way you carry anything that matters, not as a trophy, but as a tool. What she was feeling was gratitude. Not the performed kind, the real kind. The kind that comes from understanding that you were given exactly the conditions you needed to become what you were trying to become, that the laughter in the briefing room and Holt's folder thrown at her face, and the fuel gauge past bingo, and the 40-meter margin, and the 4-minute gap, and Torres's daughter's name were all in their different ways exactly what had been required. She climbed out of the cockpit. Rodriguez was already there. She put her hand on the aircraft for a moment, just a moment, then she walked away. Her last night at Bagram Holloway found her in the chow hall. He sat down across from her without asking. She looked up. I have been thinking, he said, about what I said. After the Korengal mission, about willingness. I remember, she said. I was right about what I said, he said, but I left something out. She waited. Willingness can be taught, he said. I did not think that before. I thought it was something you either had or you did not. But I have been watching you for months, and I think I was wrong about that. He paused. I think you can teach someone to decide in advance what they are available for. I think you can teach them to look at the thing that scares them and ask not whether they can avoid it, but whether avoiding it is something they are willing to live with. She looked at him. You are going to be a good teacher, he said. I have not been yet, she said. No, he said, but you will be. They ate in silence. Then Holloway said, what are you going to tell them, the pilots at the weapons school, when they ask you what the A-10 requires? She thought about her father. She thought about Rodriguez and his pre-dawn inspections. She thought about Torres walking 30 meters down a corridor on a cane to sit by a window and look at the flight line. She thought about Merritt and his cardboard sign and the marker he must have had in his kit. She thought about Brooks's voice on the radio, controlled and clear, and carrying fear inside it the way a fist carries something fragile carefully without letting the grip show. She thought about the sound the A-10 cannon made when it spoke over the North Ridgeline, and the way that sound had rolled down the valley like something geological. And the way Brooks had said to no one in particular, she came down. "I will tell them," she said, "that the aircraft does not ask you to be fearless. It asks you to be honest about what the mission requires, about what the people on the ground need, about what you are willing to cost yourself in service of the transaction you signed up for." Holloway was quiet. "And I will tell them," she said, "that the day you fly it right, the day you really fly it right, you will not feel like a hero. You will feel like someone who did what the situation required. And that feeling, that specific, ordinary feeling of having done what was required is the whole thing. That is the whole thing." Holloway nodded. He did not add anything, because there was nothing to add. She left Bagram on a transport flight at 0600 the next morning. Rodriguez was on the flight line when she walked out. He handed her something. It was a photograph, a better one this time, taken with a real camera, clear and sharp. It was the A-10, her A-10 sitting on the flight line in the morning light with the mountains behind it. Not a pose photograph, a working photograph, the kind taken without announcement. The aircraft exactly as it was, in daily use, patched and weathered, and entirely functional. On the back, Rodriguez had written 4 words. She ran honest, always. She folded the photograph. She put it in her pocket. Next to the letter, next to the photograph of 12 soldiers standing with a cardboard sign, she walked to the transport. She did not look back. Not because the place did not matter, because the place had already become part of what she carried, and what you carry moves with you. And looking back is for people who are not yet sure they have the thing inside them. She was sure. She boarded the transport and found a seat, and the aircraft lifted off. And below her, the base shrank, and the mountains expanded, and the country unfolded in its enormous and different complexity, and she looked out the window at it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes. She was not sleeping. She was deciding for the 10,000th time since Columbus what she was available for. The answer was the same as it had always been. Everything the people on the ground needed, everything it cost. All of it, without reservation and without apology, and without the need for anyone's permission or approval or understanding. Because on the day that mattered, she had looked at a fuel gauge in a valley, and a 4-minute gap, and a 22-year-old soldier who had gone still inside himself, and she had made the only choice she had ever been capable of making. She came down. That was who Captain Madison Reed was. That was who she had always been. And no briefing room laughter, no folder thrown at her face, no inspector general's review, no bingo fuel alarm, no mountain wall. Closing in on both sides had ever changed that, and nothing that came next ever would. Angel had come down, and the people she came down